ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for watching the show. This is your Top Think Tanks review, and I'm your host, Bryce Dolan. Today on the show, we're going to look at 5 different top 50 United States think tanks and look at the top stories from each one of their websites. To begin our show today, we start with Human Rights Watch. It may be World AIDS Day, but the prospect of an AIDS-free generation, a goal articulated by President Barack Obama, is uncertain. While new HIV infections in the United States have dropped nearly 20% in the past decade, African Americans, men who have sex with men, and transgender women are disproportionately inflicted by the disease. President-elect Donald Trump has said little about the 1.2 million people living with HIV in the United States, leaving his policies on this health crisis a matter of speculation. That should be cause for alarm. An outbreak of HIV infections in Indiana while Vice President-elect Mike Pence was governor stands as a sober warning of how quickly an epidemic can emerge in the absence of strong and effective policies. In December of 2014, the tiny town of Austin, Indiana became the epicenter of one of the worst HIV outbreaks among injection drug users in decades. Syringe exchange, a key tool in preventing the spread of HIV, was illegal under state law. Drug users in Austin routinely shared needles, a practice that carries a high risk of HIV transmission. Nearly 200 of Austin's 4,200 residents, almost 5% of its population, became HIV positive in 1 year, accounting for about 1/3 of Indiana's new HIV infections in 2014. Of those infected with HIV, 84% also tested positive for hepatitis C. When the outbreak was discovered, officials began a mad scramble to bring public health services to Scott County, where Austin is located. But the county was ill-equipped to deal with this emergency. It had only one primary care physician and no drug dependence treatment centers. Eventually, Pence allowed syringe exchange programs to begin operating on an emergency basis. Now, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, has since identified 220 other impoverished rural counties across the country that, like Scott County, are at high risk of HIV outbreaks among people who inject heroin or prescription painkillers. Some counties are responding by establishing syringe exchanges, distributing medicine that can reverse an overdose, expanding HIV education to reduce stigma, and encouraging HIV testing. But federal leadership is key to ensuring vital funding for syringe exchanges and other evidence-based approaches that prevent the spread of HIV. It's also key in preventing the implementation of misguided and harmful approaches, like making syringe exchanges illegal. If the Trump-Pence administration shares the hope of seeing an AIDS-free generation, this is the path they should take. It being World AIDS Day, we're going to make that our hashtag, 2 of them in fact, hashtag World AIDS Day, hashtag AIDS-free generation. Now next, the Brookings Institution says the president-elect tweeted that he will announce details on December 15th of how he will completely exit his business operations. That's not enough. Although it is of course important that he have no involvement in Trump business operations, he, in order to avoid conflicts, must also exit the ownership of his businesses through a blind trust or equivalent. Otherwise, he will have a personal financial interest in his businesses that will sometimes conflict with the public interest and constantly raise questions. For example, unless he divests ownership, he will have an interest in the foreign government payments and benefits that flow to his business daily. That creates such a serious conflict of interest that the framers of the Constitution prohibited it for the president in the emoluments clause. Far smaller potential conflicts led every president for 4 decades to do a blind trust or equivalent, and so should Trump. All that said, we have to wait for the details. Now, if his family is going to be involved in his businesses as well, as he made so clear, this plan must include an ethics firewall. That is needed so that neither he nor anybody else in his administration is talking to his kids about business. He should start by having the children step away from the transition, not to mention from participating in his own meetings with foreign leaders. Otherwise, there is a risk of improper preferential relationships and treatment for the Trump organization with the United States government and foreign ones. Without an ethics firewall that is set up at once and continues into the administration, scandal is sure to follow. So Trump is taking a step in the right direction by relieving his operations of all of his businesses, and he's not going to be running his businesses, but it's not enough. What he needs to do next is to relinquish ownership of these businesses and do a blind trust or something of the sort that is equivalent. So there's no conflict of interest whatsoever while he is leading this country. Now next, the Council on Foreign Relations has an exciting update from Colombia. A 180-day disarmament and demobilization process of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or the FARC, is expected to begin today after lawmakers approved a new peace deal to end Colombia's 52-year war against Marxist guerrillas. The new version of the deal was not put to a national referendum after an earlier draft was defeated in an October plebiscite. The agreement revises some of the terms opposed by voters, such as the provision of special courts for rebels accused of war crimes and drug trafficking, but still offers no prison time to guerrillas who confess to war crimes and guarantees congressional representation for former FARC members. The U.S. Special Envoy to the peace process said the deal could allow the country to emerge as a model success story for Latin America. So great news for Colombia, the FARC, and the people of Colombia. Earlier on in a segment, we did a part of the show on Colombia and having their peace deal rejected by a slim margin of votes because a majority of the population thought that these Marxist guerrillas deserved to serve the consequences of their war crimes, and they wanted to see them punished before this peace deal was established. But the Colombian government, the FARC, has had enough. So they revised the peace deal, and without putting it out there for a vote, Congress went ahead and approved it, and now today it is putting into effect. So great news for Colombia there as they continue to take steps into the right direction after a 52-year-long conflict. Now next, the United States Institute of Peace states women are not just passive victims in extremist movements. Last month, 2 female suicide bombers killed 24 people in northeast Nigeria. In September, Paris police arrested 3 women for plotting a terrorist attack on behalf of the Islamic State. The same month, in Kenya, police killed 3 women who attacked the main police station in Mombasa. In a headline fairly typical of the news and commentary in such cases, the Daily Beast reported that ISIS is turning women into cannon fodder. But the findings of more than 80 interviews that the United States Institute of Peace conducted with women involved in or close to violent movements belie that idea of an entirely passive role, and it's a dynamic that the international community must understand more fully to effectively prevent or counter extremist violence. As the use of the term cannon fodder suggests, public discussion of the role of women in extremist groups often implies that they are passive actors who don't really know what they are doing. It overlooks the reality that women can be actively interested in groups such as ISIS or Al-Shabaab, seeing violence as a legitimate way to protect their interests. As a result, both public debate and programs meant to counter violent extremism failed to recognize or address these women's motivations and underlying causes. Government policies and programs meant to counter violent extremism too often assume that women by nature are peace-seeking and that where they are involved in violence, they are only victims who are being used. But women are potentially powerful actors who can either support violence or oppose it. So programs to counter such violence must not assume that women are their allies and must work to understand the motivations of women who support it, as well as those who don't. Further, these programs must then address the underlying factors that drive those motivations. These efforts are becoming more urgent as extremist movements appear to escalate the recruitment and use of women. Again this month, women were identified as perpetrators by Nigerian authorities after soldiers killed 3 female suicide bombers after they were trying to penetrate the birthplace city of Boko Haram. So as we continue to fight these terrorist groups, you have to remember it's not just the males, it's not just the men who are going to be bringing about this violence, who aren't going to be violent, who aren't going to support ISIS. Women are just as capable of men as supporting ISIS, and unfortunately, just as capable of carrying a bomb and of shooting a weapon. So I can't believe they were doing this, but you can't rule out women when you're fighting terrorist groups, because they could very easily and very likely be a part of it, especially if their husband or their loved ones were a part of it as well. Now, to end our show today, in response to the disappearance and apparent detention of attorney Zhang Tianyong on November 21st after visiting the wife and lawyer of a jailed human rights lawyer in the Hunan province. Now, Freedom House issued this following statement following his apparent abduction. Chinese police should either confirm Tianyong's detention or investigate his disappearance, as his family has repeatedly asked, says Robert Herman, Vice President for International Programs. Zhang's disappearance shows that the act of meeting relatives or lawyers of human rights activists now carries grave risks. Now, Zhang Tianyong is an outspoken advocate for human rights in China who has sought to bring attention to the broad crackdown on human rights lawyers. Before authorities in 2009 revoked his license to practice law, Zhang served as counsel for human rights defenders. Authorities have repeatedly arrested him for his human rights work and physically mistreated him while in custody. Since his disappearance on November 21st, police and railway officials refused requests by Zhang's wife, father, and lawyer to confirm Zhang's detention, investigate his disappearance, or provide security footage from the train station where he was last known to be. In Freedom House's Freedom in the World 2016 report, China was rated not free and given a score of 16 out of 100. The Congressional Executive Commission on China reported 1,433 cases of political and religious prisoners in the country as of October 11th, 2016. So as we are moving forward with the new President-elect Donald Trump and our new Vice President-elect Mike Pence, we need to carefully survey our relations with Russia and more particularly China, as China continues to oppress its civilians and an innocent population to anyone who's speaking out against human rights violations or speaking out against the government. Mr. Zhang here was just a lawyer for human rights defenders who were being arrested for peacefully exercising their rights. And then all of a sudden, the human rights lawyer disappears. And the authorities have no idea where he is, they won't tell his family, and they won't give up any evidence. So I think China, on that scale of 1 to 100, scoring a 16, has some work to do before relations between US and China can really start to grow. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that does it for our show today. If you want to check out any of these articles in their entirety, the links are provided below in the description. I encourage you to check them out. When you do that, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel so you get notified every time a new video is posted. Give us a like on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. But thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. This was your Top Think Tanks review. I was your host, Bryce Dolan.